So if we're following the bouncing ball on the chart, we're at the beginning of section E. So we've gotten to this point where the Constitution pulls back power that was moving in the direction of rights decentralization, deprivatized, not preemptive, and now it pulls back to here. Section E, which begins with a couple of references to William Lloyd Garrison, the abolitionist from Massachusetts, is about the push or pullback on behalf of expanded rights, expanded devolved power to the people for the benefit of society, to use Thomas Paine's words. And then we'll move into section F. And then section G is where we all discuss, as Earl said at lunch, what is to be done. And we couldn't remember if that was Marx or Lenin, but you know. So we start on page 173. And I'm going to read an excerpt also from something which is not in the curriculum. The focus here is on William Lloyd Garrison as a representative of the abolitionist movement. There's a piece that used to be in the curriculum that talks about a man named Ted Weld and a group of students from Lane Seminary in Ohio who convened a 12-day discussion on the abolition of slavery, where he was fired, the students were kicked out, they went across the state to Oberlin, and then developed that into this kind of a mini organization of circuit riders who would go out and teach about the necessity of abolition. And I want to read an excerpt from Frederick Douglass's speech, because we all know in someone's mind Frederick Douglass is still alive and doing great things. But we focus on Garrison starting on page 173, which is from a book called The Perfectionist Radical Social Thought in the North from 1815 to 1860. A little bit of background about William Lloyd Garrison. He and the texts we're going to look at are about his absolute resistance to the Constitution as a slave document. From 1831 to 1865, Garrison published the newspaper The Liberator once a week. And so you can look up the history of The Liberator. I was looking at one of the sites online at lunch. It kind of chronicles the kind of stuff that was included, letters, columns, essays by a number of people. Some of the words are going to be his, and then we'll look at one scenario where he shared the stage on the 4th of July with Henry David Thoreau. I believe it was in Framingham, Massachusetts, and then the actions that ensued. And so what we want to reinforce here is the pulling down in section E to say these laws, these principles are unjust, and this is the way we respond, because one of the things Garrison was known for was acts of flagrant civil disobedience. On more than one occasion, he was dragged behind a cart through Boston Common for his radical abolitionist views. And we'll look at the Thoreau appearance as one of his acts of defiance. On page 175, under the United States Constitution, these are Garrison's words talking about his view of the Constitution. As we looked at it through the last segment before lunch, there's a lot of ways you can target the Constitution for being flawed and for its consolidation of privatized, centralized, preemptive power. Garrison's attack was through the 3/5 clause and the justification and instituting slavery. So right there in the middle of that big paragraph, he's referring to them as those who support and uphold this Constitution. He says to tell them that, this is about 8 to 10 lines down from the top of that segment, to tell them that for 80 years they have misunderstood and misinterpreted their own Constitution in a manner gross and distorted beyond anything known in human history, that Washington, Jefferson, Adams, all who framed that Constitution, the Supreme Court of the United States and all its branches and all other courts, the National Congress and all state legislatures, have utterly perverted its scope and meaning. So there was talk in the country of, well, the Constitution is good and it's a good document, but these guys are just kind of misinterpreting and misapplying it. And Garrison says, to say that they've just been kind of screwing up for 60 years is the coolest and absurdest thing ever heard of beneath the stars. No, not thus are they to be allowed to escape hot censure and unsparing condemnation. They have committed no blunder. They have not erred through stupidity. They have not been misled by any legal sophistry. They are verily guilty of the most atrocious crimes and have sinned against the clearest light ever vouchsafed to any people. They have designedly framed mischief by law and consigned to chains and infamy an inoffensive and helpless race. Over on page 176. In that second full paragraph, the biggest paragraph on the page, he says, "Let there be no dodging, no shuffling, no evasion. Let us confess the sin of our fathers and our own sin as a people, and in conspiring for the degradation and enslavement of the colored race among us. Let us be honest with the facts of history and acknowledge the compromises that were made to secure the adoption of the Constitution and the consequent establishment of the Union. Let us who profess to abhor slavery and who claim to be free men indeed dissolve the bands that connect us with slave power religiously and politically." At the bottom of the page, that last 3 lines, "We charge upon the present national compact," meaning the Constitution, "that it was formed at the expense of human liberty by a profligate surrender of principle, and to this hour is cemented with human blood." Over on page 177, he continues, "We charge upon the American Constitution that it contains provisions and enjoins duties which make it unlawful for freemen to take the oath of allegiance to it, because they are expressly designed to favor a slave-holding oligarchy and consequently to make one portion of the people a prey to another. It was pleaded at the time of its adoption, it is pleaded now, that without such a compromise, they had to have the 3/5 clause or else the southern states wouldn't sign. There could have been no union, that without union, the colonies would have become an easy prey to the mother country, and hence it was an act of necessity. Deplorable indeed when viewed alone, but absolutely indispensable to the safety of the Republic. To this we reply, the plea is as profligate as the act was tyrannical. It is the Jesuitical doctrine that the end sanctifies the means. It is a confession of sin, but the denial of any guilt in its perpetration." Skip down to that next paragraph. "Better that the American Union had never been formed than that it should have been obtained at such a frightful cost. If they were guilty who fashioned it, but who could not foresee all its frightful consequences, how much more guilty are they who, in full view of all that has resulted from it, clamor for its perpetuity? If it was sinful at the commencement to adopt it on the ground of escaping a greater evil, is it not equally sinful to swear to support it for the same reason, or until in process of time it be purged from its corruption?" Let me throw in this excerpt from Frederick Douglass's speech on the 4th of July, 1952. It's called "What to a Slave is the 4th of July." Garrison and Douglass, among others, are kind of pillars of the abolitionist movement. And you have at this time, like the Levelers and the Diggers, disagreements about how to address the issue of slavery. And so you had, I'm sure at the time, we can parallel them to now, well-meaning and well-intentioned liberal progressive people who are concerned about slavery, but their answer is to take slaves and repatriate them back to Africa, the American Colonization Society. You had some, wanting to rein in the excesses of the worst slave masters, right? What Garrison and Douglass and the abolitionists were about was not creating something called the Slavery Protection Agency, but absolutely saying slavery is morally wrong, has been from the beginning, is so now. The only answer is abolition. So Douglass on the 4th of July in 1852 is talking about the 4th of July. And he says, "Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us." And throughout this speech, he's acknowledging to the crowd, and he always says, "your country," "your independence," never says "our." The blessings in which you this day rejoice are not enjoyed in common. The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your fathers is shared by you, not by me. The sunlight that brought life and healing to you has brought stripes and death to me. This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, I must mourn. To drag a man in fetters into the grand illuminated temple of liberty and call upon him to join you in joyous anthems were inhuman mockery and sacrilegious irony. Do you mean, citizens, to mock me by asking me to speak today? If so, there is a parallel to your conduct. And let me warn you that it's dangerous to copy the example of a nation whose crimes, lowering up to heaven, were thrown down by the breath of the Almighty, burying that nation in irrecoverable ruin. And then over on page 178, we go back to Garrison. Sorry, wrong page, 180. Nope, I'm still wrong. 184. 184 at the bottom. There's a number of other passages that I'll recommend to you about Garrison, but I think the words and Douglass's words suffice as an attack on the Constitution. So this is an appearance on the 4th of July 2 years later in Framingham, Massachusetts. And Thoreau and Garrison share the stage, and Garrison produces a copy of the Fugitive Slave Act, which was federal law at the time. If there's an escaped slave, escaped to a free state, it was law that you had to return the slave to his or her owner. Producing a copy of the Fugitive Slave Law, he set fire to it and burned it to ashes. And then, holding up the copy of the U.S. Constitution, he branded it as the source and parent of all other atrocities, calling it, quote, "a covenant with death and an agreement with hell," and consumed it to ashes on the spot, exclaiming, "So perish all compromises with tyranny, and let all the people say, Amen." One of the references, I misspoke. One of the references in the next section is to the folks of Lane Seminary and Ted Weld, and it refers on page 186. There's a document about the formation and purposes of the American Colonization Society. One of the strategies was, let's move freed slaves back to Africa and give them rights, but not here. Kai's going to take us through that.
Yeah, so in 186 we bring up the American Colonization Society as an example of the sort of organized activism where it came to freed slaves. You know, so now you had, in some cases, freed slaves out in society. So, you know, what to do? And so there were a collection of folks that said, well, in some ways, well, we don't really want them here, so let's put them somewhere else. And so the main charge eventually of the American Colonization Society was really about relocating freed slaves to Africa, more specifically to Liberia. So the whole country of Liberia was formed as a place to put freed slaves, in essence, to not have them be part of the society that most of them had been born to and were a part of, was basically to deport them to Africa in this case. So they were not a group that was pushing for abolition, and in a lot of real ways they were a very racist group still, because they still saw blacks as inferior to whites. And so they were looking for sort of, I guess, a middle road to deal with the reality of freed slaves. And this was their solution. So they were for a long time kind of the dominant force that had anything sort of leaning towards this idea of freed blacks in society, but of course not keeping them within the society, but deporting them. And so they were the dominant thing on what people saw. There was really no organized abolition movement that had come to visibility at that point. When abolition did eventually get to be visible, they had to contend with the American Colonization Society because a lot of credence, a lot of support, a lot of funding was going to actually, the deportation of people to somewhere else. And so the abolition movement had to confront that. They couldn't get around that because of how dominant the American Colonization Society was. Dominant enough even to have the support of England, who at that time had already abolished slavery, but there was still large support for the efforts of the American Colonization Society. And so for those who were about straight abolition, that it can't be about regulating it, it can't be about some compromise, it really needs to be about freeing people who justly should be free. They had to contend with them as really an organizing impediment to the growth of what eventually became the organized abolition movement. Jim, you had a question?
I was just curious, do they have an estimate of how many slaves were deported to Liberia?
I don't know the actual figure of how many people actually ended up through.
Would it be in the thousands or?
I don't know. I would have to look into that. I haven't really referenced to see how many people are actually sent away through their
Wasn't
efforts.
the name even of the country given because
Because it was free,
set up?
right.
Yeah. So it was this whole relocation. It was a form of, I guess, a witness protection program, or I mean, it was basically setting up a brand new system to say, well, okay, you're freed now, but we really don't want you here. We'll set up your own little, place somewhere else. So, of course, completely across the ocean itself and away from the only society that these people had known, even if it was under slavery. So these were the things that Garrison himself had to confront. In fact, Garrison showed up in England to talk about the American Colonization Society, to get what were the abolitionists of English society to understand the harm that they were causing, how they were being an impediment and a barrier to really true abolition. And it took some effort on his part, but eventually he was able to break the hold of the American Colonization Society and really begin to have abolition itself become front and center. Flipping to page 189 and then to 190, this piece here is really about Ted Weld. So Brad mentioned Ted Weld from Lane Seminary. He and some students hosted this many-day, many-hour discussion about the morality of slavery. And so if you look on page 190, they actually had two things that they were discussing. And it was a 18-day, 45-hour discussion of the question. So can you imagine people sitting down for 18 days having this deep discussion about this idea of slavery and various components of what was happening at that time? So at the top of page 190, it says the seminary in February 1834 held a prodigious 18-day, 45-hour discussion of the questions. 1, ought the people of the slaveholding states to abolish slavery immediately? And remember, this is in the 1830s, so this is still very much at the height of slavery. So it's not as if we're at the point of slavery going away. This is many, many decades before the adoption of the 13th Amendment, for instance, to the U.S. Constitution. But here you are having people talk about straight abolition of slavery and not the work of the American Colonization Society. So in fact, the second question that they posited to one another was, are the doctrines and tendencies and measures of the American Colonization Society such as to render it worthy of the patronage of Christian public? So they initially were taking this very Christian view of the issue of slavery itself, but also, were the American Colonization Society efforts really of the highest Christian value? Is this what we want to be doing as Christians? So it started out as this very religious, moral discussion in the beginning, and eventually they understood it needed to become something more than that it couldn't just stay within that moral framework, that it eventually had to move to the legal and constitutional frameworks as well. And as Brad mentioned, the act of doing so got Ted Weld kicked out of Lane Seminary, ended up at Oberlin College. A number of the students followed him to Oberlin. If you look at the bottom of that same paragraph, about 4 lines up to the end of that paragraph, it says, at first he was a lone agent in the reserve, talking about his time at Lane. Later he was selected and trained 12 rebels as colleagues to extend the revivals. Finally, in 1836, on commission from the national headquarters, he increased the number to 70, 30 of whom still were from the Lane group. So these were the very beginnings of kind of the freedom riders of their time going out around talking about abolition. They were known as the Lane Rebels. They got some funding from a guy named Tappan, very large, wealthy gentleman from New York City, who also helped fund William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator. So there was some money involved in helping get this stuff off the ground. But Ted Weld was a very principal person in the building out of the abolition movement and getting others to speak out against it as well. In that next paragraph down, I'm just going to point to that last line where he says, slavery was a sin, a crime, and monstrous evil, and an anachronism of which must be abolished immediately. So there was not, again, about this regulation of it, this phase out. It was about immediate abolition, that these people had come to a point, they felt that society needed to come to a point to just basically cease and desist where it came to slavery. And where I said it had to move out of that kind of religious moral discussion and into the legal and constitutional. If you move to page 191, where it says here, the original ethico-moral religious indictment gave way to one framed increasingly in legal and constitutional terms. So they understood that the conversation had to get beyond that 18-day one from this Christian moral viewpoint to something that had to do, again, with legal constitutional structures, because they understood the power of how that system was suppressing rights. Well, they needed to actually grab a hold of that same system to recognize rights, and that's the frame that needed to be moved. Interestingly, the efforts started to include other people that were being persecuted or oppressed under the system of law. They also leaned not on the Constitution, but on the Declaration of Independence. So further down on page 191, where it has the number 1 listed there, where it talks about its central theme and argument derived from the self-evident truths of the Declaration of Independence, not the mere excesses or abuses of the slave system, but rather its denial of the protection for which all governments were instituted and to which all human beings were entitled by their humanity. So they didn't find the possibility of advocating in what they needed to advocate for in the Constitution, but they found that capability, echoed through the Declaration of Independence. And you see other people also latching on really to the Declaration of Independence and not the Constitution, because of what the Declaration of Independence puts out around the formation of government, about this idea of rights. And so that's where they found a lot of their power to do the work that they did in abolition. And then just to finish up this piece, on the next paragraph down where it's labeled number 2, just to show that some of the mentality started to get broader than just the freeing of the slaves. It says, what thus began as a campaign for protection of slaves and free Negroes presently became one to guarantee civil liberties more generally. Obliged to defend even their rights to discuss slavery, to seek its overthrow by constitutional means. Abolitionists focused intently on the problem of securing and enforcing constitutional rights. They were interested not merely in their own rights, but also in those of other dissident and unpopular groups, including Indians and Mormons. Protection of these rights were not merely against invasions by government action, but against private action and mob violence as well as the goal. And of course, we're eventually move into this period of time where the suffrage movement also begins to take shape. And of course, there were tensions between abolition and suffrage, and could they be combined? Should they be run separately? Of course, history shows that abolition was what was pushed first. Suffrage came, of course, 40, 50 years later. But it was very much being talked about in the same vein that folks from the Lane Seminary group were talking about, this greater idea of greater civil liberties, greater rights for not just freed slaves or for slaves at that time, but for other groups out there, including women. So from there, we wanted to move into kind of spotlighting, at least very briefly, what was the role of the North. So of course, during the Civil War, the North versus the South, and of course, it's always painted as the North being, the protectors of people and rights, and all the good people lived in the North and all the bad people lived in the South. and that the North had nothing to do with slavery. It was all strictly, again, the South. But we have a piece in our book that Brad will talk about called Complicity that begins to highlight really the true history around the North's role in slavery and how they were very much not separate from it, but very much involved. Very much so, of course, economically speaking, because probably 3/4 of our country's economy at that time had to do with slavery, and the North was very much part of all that, not separate from it.
Apologies again up front for the flipping back, because we're now moving back in the numerical order of the curriculum. I'm going to refer you back to page 100, so maybe keep your thumb where we just were on page 192. This is an excerpt from a book called Black Protest History Documents and Analyses. It's from a section by a man named Harvey Wish. And I'm just going to very lightly skim it. It's about American slave insurrections before 1861. And I just want to highlight that in those 3 or 4 pages that we've excerpted, he's talking about slave revolts. We know of Nat Turner's Rebellion. We've probably heard of John Brown. But the lesser known ones he highlights from 1687 to 1845, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Virginia, in New York City, Maryland, Louisiana, Florida, elsewhere in New York State. And so he paints this picture of throughout the South and in a couple of northern locations, what we don't know much about in terms of slave revolts and the rebellion against their conditions of forced servitude were more widespread than we're aware. If you think about the movie Lincoln, if you saw it, there's a part of that narrative which suggests that because of Lincoln's political pragmatism, he, along with key congressional leaders, were able to get the 13th Amendment through Congress on the way to ratification. The truth is, without people like Garrison and Douglas and Harriet Tubman, Ted Weld and the students from Lane, and the massive number of slave revolts throughout the South in the wake of Sherman's March to the Sea, it's entirely possible the 13th Amendment would not have been passed. And so Harvey Wish's section there, where he highlights the different nature of those slave insurrections, is important reading. The piece that Kai referred to, the title page of the book, is called Complicity on page 107. And it's written by 3 reporters who at the time were writing for the Hartford Courant, the main daily newspaper in Hartford, Connecticut. The subtitle is How the North Promoted, Prolonged, and Profited from Slavery. It was their research over a number of years into this notion or myth that the North was the protected, enlightened place and did not participate in the mechanisms of slavery that led them to write this book. And we just have a 1-page excerpt from the introduction on page 108. That first full paragraph, they write that well before that point, meaning the end of the Civil War and the passage of the 13th Amendment, when nearly 4 million people were living in slavery, they write, well before that point, slavery had become the foundation of a network of interdependent economic systems throughout the country that rested on the premise that it was acceptable to view black human beings as property. The natural consequences of this deeply racist premise were resistance and violence. So if you think back to Du Bois and the piece from Satya in India last night, the extension of empire always had with it the promise of reprisals and violence as a way to make sure that the laws were enforced. They continue by saying, the North was in the perfect position, however, to deal with resistance and violence. By and large, the region's relationship with slavery, though extraordinarily profitable, was a distant one. That distance always allowed the North to minimize, even deny its links with the institution that fueled its prosperity. And they give you 3 bullet points to consider. New England and the Mid-Atlantic began their economic ascent in the 18th century because the regions grew and shipped food to help feed millions of slaves in the West Indies. Northern merchants, shippers, and financial institutions, many based in New York City, were crucial players in every phase of the national and international cotton trade. Meanwhile, the rivers and streams of the North particularly in New England, were crowded with hundreds of textile mills. Well before the Civil War, the economy of the entire North relied heavily on cotton grown by millions of slaves in the South. Even some smaller industries had these distant but vital links to slavery. Starting before the Civil War and lasting up to the edge of the 20th century, 2 Connecticut towns, close in their own backyard, were an international center for ivory production, milling hundreds of thousands of tons of elephant tusks procured through the enslavement or death of as many as 2 million people in Africa. And then they write at the end of the introduction, Harriet Beecher Stowe from Connecticut in her work, she's the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, said that slavery, this was the way slavery, the way Northerners liked it. All of the benefits and none of the screams. I'll just throw in here 2 recommendations. I wrote a couple of titles of books that I thought would be useful to mention to you. There's a brand new imaginative book written by a guy named, what is his name? I gotta remember his name. The name of the book is called Underground Airlines, and his premise is that slavery never ended, the 13th Amendment was never passed, and that it continued to this day. And over time, because of this economic interdependence, more and more states realized they had to get rid of it, but there were 4 states left. And I forget what they're called, but they're referred to as the 4 holdouts. And there are laws passed federally about whether you can do business with those 4 states. It's an imaginative, fictional construction of this very relationship. I'll look up the author. The title is Underground Airlines. There's also a very good novel by a man named Colson Whitehead, I'll write it on the board, called The Underground Railroad. And it's his imagination of these of slaves escaping the South. But the imaginative construct is well worth your time. We move now to, as Kai mentioned, the overlap between the abolitionists and the suffragists. We're going to look quickly at a couple of women who, in the context of, check our order first. What are you doing? You got that one first?
Yeah, I was gonna do this.
Okay, I was out of order. Let me set that up differently. The 13th Amendment was one of the 3 that are called the Civil War Amendments. And so you got the 13th, 14th, and 15th, and those are on page 193. 193.
193. So we have these in here just to remind us again what came out of, all the various slave revolts, the abolitionist movement, of course, the Civil War itself, also all other political happenings to get to this point. Where there were the radical Republicans who were the political arm of the abolitionist movement, basically, that were the ones who set up the adoption eventually of the various Civil War amendments. Another piece of that history, at least from the congressional standpoint, is I think for almost 20 years there was a gag order in Congress to not bring up the abolition of slavery. So even the legislative body wasn't even going to consider it. So as we go back to the constitutional structure, we saw there would be no consideration of it until 1808, until there could be that breeding population on the soil here, such that you wouldn't need to import as many slaves. Also need to understand that legislatively speaking, even though the Constitution would allow for that consideration, they did everything they can to make sure that conversation wasn't even brought up in the the Congress itself. It took a long time before that even consideration came to be, and it, of course, had to build a political arm that again had to rise up from the actions of people and communities all over the place, whether it was the Ted Welds or the Garrisons or others, to eventually get to that point, and of course the war itself. So the outcome, at least constitutionally speaking, so there's pushback on power and moving towards something that would recognize greater rights, has come out in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution. So on page 193, you have the language there. The 13th Amendment was ratified in 1865. Its purpose was to outlaw slavery. Though if you read it under Section 1, it says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. There's an interesting documentary out now called The 13th. I don't know if anyone has seen that. But it's a discussion about whether or not anything really real has come out of the 13th Amendment for African Americans, because the idea of that no one should be enslaved except if you've been duly convicted. So this idea of finding other means through criminalizing activities, whether it's drug possession or something else, and finding a different way to enslave people, even constitutionally, that's supposed to be outlawed. So there's people who talk in that film very passionately and I think very accurately about not only where things have gone, potentially because of really the lack of true reality to the 13th Amendment, but also, interestingly enough, talking about the corporate influence within that particular world. So privatized prisons, or the corporate detention centers that are out there, but how all that stuff's privatized for someone to make a profit off of. They even know we have amendments to our Constitution that want to recognize rights, how the system has found other ways, in a lot of ways, to continue to enslave people. But that's the 13th Amendment. The 14th is one that we're going to get to when we start talking about corporate constitutional rights, because it becomes a major player to this evolution of seeing corporations as persons under their constitutional law. So the 14th Amendment is really about the extension of rights. In Section 1, it reads, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person's life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny any persons within its jurisdictions the equal protections of the laws. So the equal protection and due process clause of the 14th Amendment are the main parts of that particular adoption to the Constitution. Then on page 194, you have the 15th Amendment, which is about the extension of voting rights. Timeline-wise, that it was 1870, so 5 years after the 13th Amendment came the 15th Amendment. 14th Amendment was ratified in 1868. Again, 15th Amendment in 1870. It reads here, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall be not denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Of course, there was the stipulation that if you were a woman, voting, of course, was not in the cards, that this would apply to men. So it wasn't as freeing and liberating as the wording would make it seem. So there was this sense, though, and we'll get into some other pieces here in a little bit, about this being kind of the second American Revolution, this idea of rights being recognized, about this greater sense of personal liberty over that of commerce and property. And so people started to grab onto that and tried to exercise what they thought were really the extension of new rights, that people should be recognized under this new form of governance because of these amendments. So if you skip ahead to page 223, the next couple pieces are really about women's rights, or really the lack thereof during this period of time. So on page 223, you have a case called Minor versus Happersett, which went up to the Supreme Court level. And just to kind of set the scene of what this case was about, at the top of the page there it reads, Mrs. Virginia Minor, a native born free, white citizen of the United States and of the state of Missouri over the age of 21 years, wishing to vote for the electors of President and Vice President of the United States and for Representative of Congress and for other offices at the general election held in November 1872. So Virginia Minor, had walked in and voted. And so the case was about, whether or not she had the right to do so. As you can see, the middle of the page there, the question is presented in this case whether since the adoption of the 14th Amendment, so since the 14th Amendment, equal protection, due process under the law, well, it should make sense that women should be able to vote if they're going to be seen as equals under this new amendment to the Constitution. Is a woman who is a citizen of the United States and of the state of Missouri is a voter of that state, notwithstanding the provisions of the Constitution and laws of the state, which confine the right of suffrage to men alone. The next following piece is coming from the judge himself, a guy named Chief Justice Waite, And here's what he had to say to that particular question. Certainly, if the courts can consider any question settled, this is one. For nearly 90 years, the people have acted upon the idea that the Constitution, when it conferred citizenship, did not necessarily confer the right of suffrage. If uniform practice long continued can settle the construction of so important an instrument as the Constitution of the United States, confessingly is, most certainly it has been done here. Our province is to decide what the law is, not to declare what it should be. Turning to page 224, he continues, we have given this case the careful consideration its important demands. If the law is wrong, it ought to be changed, but the power for that is not with us. And then skipping down in that paragraph to the last 3 lines, no argument as to the woman's need of suffrage can be considered. We can only act upon her rights as they exist. It is not for us to look at the hardship of withholding. Our duty is, and if we find it is within the power of the state to withhold. So even though the 14th Amendment said what it said, his view was, well, this is a state power issue. We're going to rest on the cultural view that women don't have this right. So there's really nothing here to consider, even though we have this particular language now in the Constitution. It's our opinion as Supreme Court justices that Virginia Minor does not have the right to vote. The next case is also dealing with women's rights. In this case, not the right to vote, but the right to actually practice law. And this came out of a state Supreme Court case in Illinois. So the bottom of the page from Bradwell versus the state of Illinois. And this is from the opinion written by the court. We're going to read a couple segments from that to give you a sense of how the law viewed women in the professional sense. It says, man is or should be women's protector and defender. In case all the women here have forgotten that, this judge wants you to remember that. The natural and proper timidity and delicacy which belongs to the female sex evidently unfits it for many of the occupations of civil life. Moving down 5-6 lines, so firmly fixed was the sentiment in the founders of the common law that it became a maxim of that system of jurisprudence that a woman had no legal existence separate from her husband, who was regarded as her head and representative in the social state, and notwithstanding some recent modifications of the civil status. So we talked about the law being the law and the law continuing to be the law. We can see how powerful it is in shaping the court's view of the fact that even with the 14th Amendment, well, sorry, women, you aren't able to be seen in the same way as men are and have the same rights, and therefore we're going to rest on what we've always rested on, which is you are not recognized as equal under the law, even though we have an equal protection clause as part of the Constitution at this point. And to finish here, skipping one line, he says, one of these is that a married woman is incapable without her husband's consent of making contracts which will be binding on her or him. So that she, practicing as an attorney, wouldn't be able to do so without the consent of her husband, because she is incapable of doing so for all the reasons that he said at the beginning of that passage. On page 225, we have a piece called Breaking Unjust Laws. And this is our kind of one theatrical performance part of the Democracy School. This is an excerpt from that particular trial. The judge in this case, Judge Hunt, eventually became a Supreme Court judge, but this is from a case where he was a judge in a lower court in New York State. And to make this work, we need 2 actors. We need a Judge Hunt and a Miss Anthony. Anybody want to volunteer for one of those roles?
I'm judgmental.
What's that? All right, so the 2 of you. So I would like you to be Judge Hunt, and I'd like you to be Miss Anthony.
He always subverts the gender paradigm.
So just, we're going to work through that on page 225, and then it'll go into 227.
Has the prisoner anything to say why sentence shall not be pronounced?
Yes, Your Honor, I have many things to say, for your ordered verdict of guilty have trampled underfoot every vital principle of our code. My natural rights, my civil rights, my political rights, my judicial rights are all alike ignored. Robbed of the fundamental privilege of citizenship, I am degraded from the status of a citizen to that of a subject. and not only myself individually, but all of my sex, are, by your honor's verdict, doomed to political subjugation under this so-called form of government.
The court cannot listen to a recorded argument the prisoner's counsel has already consumed 3 hours in presenting.
May it please your honor, I'm not arguing the question, but simply stating the reasons why sentence cannot, in justice, be pronounced against me. Your denial of my citizens' right to vote is the denial of my right to consent as one of the governed, the denial of my right of representation as one of the taxed, the denial of my right to a trial by jury for my peers as an offender against the law, therefore the denial of my sacred rights to life, liberty, property, and...
The court cannot allow the prisoner to go on.
But your honor will not deny me this one and only poor privilege of protest against this high-handed outrage upon my citizens' rights. May it please the court to remember that since the day of my arrest last November, this is the first time that either myself or any person in my disenfranchised class has been allowed a word of defense before the judge or jury.
The prisoner must sit down. The court cannot allow it.
All of my prosecutors, from the 8th Ward corner grocery politician who entered the complaint, the United States Marshal, Commissioner, District Attorney, District Judge, Your Honor on the bench, not one is my peer, but each and all are my political sovereigns. And had Your Honor submitted my case to the jury as was clearly your duty, even then I should have had just cause of protest, for not one of those men was my peer, but native or foreign-born, white or black, rich or poor, educated or ignorant, awake or asleep, sober or drunk, each and every man of them was my political superior, hence in no sense my peer. Even under such circumstances, a commoner of England, tried before a jury of lords, would have far less cause to complain than I should. A woman tried before a jury of men. Even my counsel, the Honorable Henry R. Selden, who has argued for my cause so ably, so earnestly, so unanswerably before Your Honor, is my political sovereign. Precisely as no disenfranchised person is entitled to sit upon a jury, and no woman is entitled to a franchise, so none but a regularly admitted lawyer is allowed to practice in the courts. No woman can gain admission to the bar. Hence, judge, jury, counsel, must all be of the superior class.
The court must insist the prisoner has been tried according to established forms of law.
Yes, Your Honor, but your forms of law are all made by men, interpreted by men, administered by men, in favor of men, and against women, and hence Your Honor's ordered verdict of guilty against a United States citizen for the exercise of that citizen's right to vote, simply because that citizen was a woman and not a man. But yesterday, the same man-made forms of law declared it a crime punishable with a $1,000 fine and 6 months imprisonment for you or me or any of us to give a cup of cold water, a crust of bread, or a night's shelter to a panting fugitive as he was tracking his way to Canada. And every man or woman in whose veins courses a drop of human sympathy violated that wicked law, reckless of consequences, and was justified in so doing. As then, the slaves who got their freedom must take it over, or under, or through the unjust forms of law. Precisely so. Now, must women, to get their right to a voice in this government, take it. And I have taken mine, and mean to take it at every possible opportunity.
The court orders the prisoner to sit down. I will not allow another word.
And that provoked her. When I was brought before Your Honor for trial, I hoped for a broad and liberal interpretation of the Constitution and its recent amendments that should declare all United States citizens under its protecting aegis, that should declare equality of rights the national guarantee to all persons born or naturalized in the United States. But failing to get this justice, failing even to get a trial by a jury of my peers, I ask not leniency at your hands, but rather the full rigors of the law.
The court must insist. The prisoner will stand up. The sentence of the court is that you pay a fine of $100 and the cost of the prosecution.
May it please Your Honor, I shall never pay $1 of your unjust penalty. All the stock and trade I possess is a $10,000 debt incurred by publishing my paper, The Revolution, 4 years ago, the sole object of which was to educate all women to do precisely as I have done, rebel against your man-made, unjust, unconstitutional forms of law that tax, fine, imprison, and hang women, while they deny them the right of representation in the government. And I shall work on with might and main to pay every dollar of that honest debt, but not a penny shall go to this unjust claim. and I shall earnestly and persistently continue to urge all women to the practical recognition of the old revolutionary maxim that resistance to tyranny is obedience to God.
Madam, the court will not order you committed until the fine is paid.
Thank you, Ms. Anthony.
I know her sister.
Is that really like
Oh. It is?
And she never paid the fine.
It's pretty articulate.
I'll say.
She spent
And that
time
was
in jail?
several
Very
times.
well.
She was arrested for voting several times and never paid the fines.
Yeah, there were, part of that, I think part of this particular case was 12 other women who had also voted, illegally. So it was their form of protest, it was their form of a sit-in, or however you want to look at it. So, and the other interesting thing about the suffragist movement is there were about, we think, 460 or so initiatives, laws adopted recognizing women's suffrage before the federal constitutional amendment came into play. So again, locally, state-wise, things move from the bottom up to eventually crack that upper level. And so this case is in large part here to show, one, the willingness of people to go up against unjust law because it's unjust, and the means of which they went to do so. And it wasn't just Susan B. Anthony and the others voting when they couldn't vote, but actually using lower levels of government to force the upper levels to change. And the suffragists did that as part of their movement to eventually get the Constitution itself amended in the early 20th century there. We're going to flip back now to page 197 and begin to talk about some of what happened after the Civil War. So you have the Civil War amendments. You also had the federal Congress passing legislation at the congressional level to uphold the new amendments to actually act as if the federal government had a responsibility to protect rights. But of course, eventually you also had things go a very different direction when it came to the Reconstruction in the South. And so I think at least this next piece is going to begin to talk about what did that begin to look like, why did it happen, some of the circumstances that led to a very different change in direction of how the government viewed things like what we would say to be basic civil rights at the point of things like the 14th Amendment, which is again what Virginia Minor and Susan B. Anthony were arguing about. We're saying, well, wait a second, we have this language now, so be it what your laws used to be, our society is now recognizing something different, so why are we not being recognized under this new way of government? And of course, African Americans were very much in the same place, and we have a piece in a little bit here that begins to talk about protections for blacks in the post-Civil War era. Again, what the government was doing for a while there and what it began to do very differently, again, because how the system had interpreted, the responsibility, for instance, of the federal government.
So, quick quiz, scale of 1 to 10. 1 is you don't have much knowledge at all. 10 is you're an expert and could teach it. How would you rate your knowledge of Reconstruction, the period of Reconstruction after the Civil War? And so we reflect back on the nature of the public education system and what it teaches and what it doesn't. So when we start the Harlem Renaissance in my junior class, I have that same question. And so if it makes you feel any better, students now don't know any more than most of the rest of the country. So as Kai mentioned last night, or this morning I guess it was, as we look at the diagram here, the abolitionist suffragists, section E, we kind of talk about this as a second American Revolution, which many people, many black scholars especially, including Du Bois, use in reference to Reconstruction. That it was this, and the metaphor I use in my classroom is this opening of a window when the promises of the Declaration and some of the promises of the Constitution are actually able to be realized because of the 13th Amendment, the 14th, and the 15th, 1865 to 1870. Jim?
And it seems like this, B, C, and most of D, we really talked about the action being in the legislature. But this last little bit, we're talking about the courts. At some point,
from the Constitution's adoption to now, what we're talking about now, is there a body of precedent being built up that's starting to become the rationalization for changes to the interpretation of the amendments?
And it starts in.
There's hope, in other words, through the courts?
No, that part is
Okay.
not true.
Okay, I see.
But the consolidation of power starts during Reconstruction. Because the window is open, and there are certain interests that see the window needs to be shut. So you have from 1865 roughly to about 1876. So it's, again, a pretty short period of time. This opening up of possibility and democratic opportunity in the South especially. There were more black officials elected to public office in that 11-year period than at any time in our history, including now. You have the South basically in ruins economically and physically because of the devastation of the war. So Reconstruction was literally about reconstructing physical buildings and institutions. But now you have a new governing structure which says 4 million people are now freed. You have economic institutions which are now open to freed slaves. And the 14th and 15th Amendment now are declaring citizenship and voting rights for these very people. You can imagine the power structure in the South not welcoming such an open window, right? And so what we know from history is that the way to make sure that those provisions from the constitutional amendments, which then had civil rights acts passed to, so the 14th and 15th Amendments say that Congress shall have power to pass appropriate legislation. So there's federal legislation passed. The way you make sure that those laws are enforced and carried out in the South is how? How did they make sure that Reconstruction stayed in place until the window closed? Occupation. Federal troops there to enforce the law, right? So you can imagine the hostility that's already latent because the war is lost, the South is destroyed. Now you got these Yankee troops coming down to make us obey the law. So all of these contributing factors are why the window was open for such a short time. One of the books that I'll recommend, and it's on the board, is a book called White Rage by a woman named Carol Anderson. It's specifically focused on racial relations, black and white, but it's an excellent examination historically of a racial microcosm of that chart. That whenever progress was made on behalf of civil rights, how the white power structure, white rage, and white bigotry snapped it back to make sure that those civil rights gains were not actually realized in full. The passage we look at on page 197 and 198 and following from W.E.B. Du Bois is part of his analysis of what happened in the South. It's from the book called Black Reconstruction in America, Du Bois's book. This is a chapter, as you can see at the top of the page, titled Counter-Revolution of Property. So you have the opening up democratic institutions, more blacks running for elected office. Free slaves now have access to economic opportunities, owning land, etc. On the top of page 198, Du Bois writes about the next step would have been, under law and order, gradually to have replaced the wrong leaders by a better and better sort. This the Negroes and many whites sought to do from 1870 to 1876. But they failed because the military dictatorship behind labor did not function successfully in the face of the Ku Klux Klan, and especially because the appeal of property in the South got the ear of property in the North. Think back to complicity and the interdependent economic relationships those writers wrote about. Du Bois goes on, after the war, industry in the North found itself with a vast organization for production, new supplies of raw material, a growing transportation system on land and water, and a new technical knowledge of processes. All this with the exclusion of foreign competition through a system of import taxes and a vast immigration of laborers tremendously stimulated the production of goods and available services. But to whom were the new goods and increased services to belong, and in whose hands would lie the power which that ownership gave? You have this opening up of this huge new market. who gets these resources? Is it going to be spread under the force of violence and federal troops to this newly freed population, or will it be consolidated back in the hands of the usual few? An almost unprecedented scramble for this new power, new wealth, and new income ensued. It broke down old standards of wealth distribution, old standards of thrift and honesty. It led to the anarchy of thieves, grafters, and highwaymen. It threatened the orderly processes of production as well as government and morals. The governments, federal, state, and local, had paid 3/5 of the cost of the railroads and handed them over to individuals and corporations to use for their profit. An empire of rich land larger than France, Belgium, and Holland together had been snatched from the hands of prospective peasant farmers and given to investors and land speculators. All of the national treasure of coal, oil, copper, gold, and iron had been given away for a song to be made the monopolized basis of private fortunes with perpetual power to tax labor for the right to live and work. So you have this consolidation of corporate along with state power to get the economic resources back in the hands of the few, not to do a revolutionary Second American Revolution spreading to the newly freed population. On the top of page 199, the copper of Michigan, the coal, steel, and oil of Pennsylvania came under control, and at the same time the bankers and financiers began to bend the manufacturers and the railroads to their will by their monopoly of investment capital and direction of its distribution, which they secured by guaranteeing income to small investors. You see here the kind of the rise of the robber barons. Right below the middle of the page, this control of super capital and big business was being developed during the 10 years of Southern Reconstruction and was dependent and consequent upon the failure of democracy in the South, just as it fattened upon the perversion of democracy in the North. And when once the control of industry by big business was certain, through consolidation and manipulation that included both North and South, big business shamelessly deserted not only the Negro, but the cause of democracy, not only in the South, but in the North. What happened in the election of 1876? Extra credit history quiz. Here's a hint. It's a precursor of Bush v. Gore.
I think Rutherford B. Hayes lost electoral college, or he won the, I forget how it goes, but either way, I think House of Representatives decided on the election of Rutherford B. Hayes took the presidency.
Hayes ends up being president.
Yes, against Samuel Tilden.
And Tilden was the Democrat, Hayes is the Republican. And remember, we're talking about 1876, a time when the South was almost exclusively Democrat. The Republicans are in the North. The Republicans are the party of Lincoln. They're the radical Republicans who push for Reconstruction, the federal troop deployment in the South. And so you have the Electoral College. The election is disputed. There's a discrepancy in the votes. And so the decision is not sent to the Supreme Court as it was in the year 2000. It's left to a special commission, which is made up of 5 of the Supreme Court justices and 10 congressmen. So you got 15 men who are to decide who is the president. And you can imagine, I mean, it just reeks of all the backroom smoky deals, right? They're meeting, and what do I get, and who's going to give me this, and so they're supposed to choose, does Tilden win it or does Hayes win it? And so to see what happened, and this is all connected to Reconstruction at the same time, turn to page 202. So it's actually in an excerpt from a book called Building Unions, because it's connected to labor, and you'll see how in a minute. Under 1876 railroading and election, you heard Du Bois referring to the railroads and how that gave them carte blanche to expand and control massive amounts of resources at 3/5 the cost. So here we have the railroads again. Kelman says by the 1870s, the railroad corporations were literally running the country. So he talks about the disputed election, the Committee of 15. Here's what really happened. This is according to labor historian Philip Foner. The actual determination was made by Thomas Scott, president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. who, in return for assurances of support for a Texas Pacific Railroad, so he's making this deal. These 15 people, 5 justices, 10 congressmen, can I get a majority of support who will, because we want this Texas Pacific Railroad. When he gets those assurances, he says, I can give you the votes of the Southern congressmen on this committee. It is hardly, so they're going to vote for Hayes. The deal is, if they give their votes to Hayes, the federal troops will be pulled out of the South, and Reconstruction is over. It is hardly an accident, Foner goes on to say, that on March 2nd, 1877, when Hayes received the telegram confirming his election, he was en route to Washington in Tom Scott's own private car. There's no illusion about the connection between the corporate state and the ruling class. He gets the telegram giving him the presidency, riding on this luxurious private railroad car with the chairman of the Pennsylvania Railroad. When those troops are pulled out of the South, so Reconstruction is no longer enforced, and we see the rise of the Klan, the Black Codes and the Jim Crow laws result over the next 50 to 75 years. Those troops are actually pulled out and then used to suppress a railroad strike at the bottom of page 202. So this is 4 months later. March 1877 is when Hayes is announced president. In July, in the midst of a depression, railroad workers struck in response to grossly unsafe working conditions, repeated pay cuts, and their strike, because they had such collective organizing power, shut down the railroads. As it spread, workers in other industries joined, and the rail strike became a general strike in a dozen major cities. Imagine that collective power, to shut down not just the railroads, but other industries in a dozen major cities. A month after he's named president, so 3 months before the strike, President Hayes had withdrawn the last of the federal troops from the South. In July, he sends them in to put down the strike. Then 3 months later in the fall, he sends them west to kill Indians. So you can see the way the corporate state manages its ruling elites. They hand somebody the presidency to close the window on Reconstruction. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, which were all passed in the wake of slavery, designed to free and then protect and empower freed slaves, living, breathing human beings. What we start to see, and we'll get to this after the next short break, is the way in which corporate interests began almost immediately after the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendments to begin building case law to find corporations in the language of those amendments, to solidify the claims of the corporate state. On page 203, real quick, there's a reference there to some of the other labor movements that began after the upheaval in 1877. I'm not sure if you know about the group called the Knights of Labor. They were seen as a bit more radical. They were also fundamentally flawed. The Knights of Labor were behind some of the anti-Chinese, anti-Japanese exclusion acts throughout the West. So none of this is perfect, but we simply talk about the way in which, on the one hand, not very many people would disagree that the deployment of federal troops into the South to uphold this new constitutional governing structure is a good and necessary thing. But as a tool of the oligarchy, they're pulled out to suppress those domestic insurrections as the Constitution allows.
And on page 202, in that indented paragraph towards the bottom, it talks about the evolution of armories, which I didn't realize was in large degree set up in preparation for putting down labor revolts. And so it makes me look at Laser Quest and Wild Walls a little bit differently in downtown Spokane. So I think to Jim's question, on page 209, we have a piece that's titled The Shifting Wind. So it wasn't only what Brad just laid out in regards to this brokering of deals of political power and capital power, and then how even to use military force to back up what the small powerful few wanted to see have happen. But it actually manifested itself in the courts as well, all the way to the Supreme Court level. So it was not only the troops pulling out, but it was also the federal Constitution pulling out of the South. And we're going to find out exactly how that came to be. So it was kind of a wholesale reversal, really, of that short, again, 10-year window period of trying to enforce this idea of greater rights protections, and then that kind of snapping back and beginning to really, again, protect property at a higher value than human life. So the publication here, The Shifting Wind, really walks through what are known as the civil rights cases of 1883. So it was a bundling of different cases of which blacks were trying to uphold these new constitutional amendments and through a variety of ways. And the ways were everything from wanting to attend a theater, to staying at an inn, to being at a restaurant, to taking the railroad, whatever it is, access to services of sort of everyday life, and how that rejection of that was continuing, even though that they were supposed to be seen as equal under the law, how that wasn't happening in a lot of these communities. And so out of a number of these cases, grew this discussion that eventually became under the heading of the Civil Rights Cases of 1883. So on page 211, just to kind of set the scene a little bit more, middle of the page, second full paragraph, page 211, the civil rights cases spoke to the issue of caste and an evolving etiquette of status degradation. They raised and partially answered the question of whatever caste subordination could be reconciled to the egalitarian language of the new amendments added to the Constitution. So this was kind of the fundamental kind of debate going on that eventually ended up into the courts. Skipping a few lines, there were 5 cases which involved allegations of anti-black discrimination and access to public accommodations in violations of Section 1 and 2 of the Civil Rights Act of 1875. So as Brad mentioned, post the Civil War Amendment adoptions, they passed additional legislation to further reinforce the constitutional amendments themselves, and they were called Civil Rights Acts. When we hear Civil Rights Acts, we may refer to the 60s, but there were ones that preceded that by 100 years. So the question on page 211 that the courts were looking at is in that final paragraph on page 211, third line down. Did Congress have the power under the Constitution to prohibit racial discrimination and access to public accommodations such as inns and theaters upon pain of civil and criminal penalties? So this was the question being put in front of the court, looking at things like the Civil Rights Act, looking at the constitutional amendments itself, looking at the fact that discrimination was still happening. What did it mean to have these laws in place if discrimination was continuing? And did the federal government really have that particular power to protect those rights? And really the initial sense was, yes, they did. I mean, not only by the presence of federal troops, but by the courts themselves. So it wasn't just the legislative body, but the courts were upholding this idea that, yes, that there was that power at the federal level. If you flip then to page 213, second full paragraph down, just to give a sense of one of these cases as part of the civil rights cases of 1883. It says, filed on March 10th, 1880, the Davis case joined other cases posing claims based on the public accommodations provisions of the Civil Rights Acts of 1875, guaranteeing that all persons within the jurisdiction of the United States shall be entitled to the full and equal enjoyment of the accommodations of inns, public conveniences, theaters, and other places of public amusement. So it was taking that equal protection sort of vagueness of the amendment and actually getting very explicit about what that meant on a practical level. So that's what the federal level legislation was all about. Switching to page 214, you begin to hear some of what the arguments were being made by the various parties, the U.S. government, and I'm not even too sure who was on the other side of the argument here, as far as who was arguing against the federal government. But on page 214, towards the top, again talking about what did it mean to have the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment prohibited the states from denying to their citizens the equal protection of the laws, although privately owned and operated most public accommodations required state licensing. Otherwise were constrained to adhere to state rules, regulations, statutes, and inspections. State oversight of privately owned businesses serving the public derived from the fact that the operation of such businesses involves significant state interests, such as the maintenance of public health, the promotion of commerce, and the facilitation of travel. Hence, in turning away the Blackmun WHR AG, Samuel Nichols was not acting in a wholly private capacity, but in one devoted to a public use, so affected with the public, i.e. state interest. So this is the federal government arguing that why those federal laws and the federal constitution have real power, that the private owner doesn't act outside of that, but there is a public interest involved, therefore the law, the public law, should pertain to that particular accommodation, that particular public use. He goes on in that next paragraph down, talking about the 13th Amendment, makes the 13th Amendment argument here. Phillips' second argument derived from the 13th Amendment was made more subtle, whereas the 14th Amendment was placed limits on state governments. The 13th was intended to place limits on the actions of private individuals. Widespread anti-black feeling translated into near universal patterns of private discrimination, denying blacks access to public accommodations, thereby in effect imposing upon blacks the kind of badge of servitude the 13th Amendment was meant to prohibit. So there's argument that even though the physical enslavement was no longer there, by denying people access to everyday aspects of life, it was basically a continuation of slavery, and that they were in violation of the 13th Amendment by denying people access to these accommodations. So eventually what happened took place on October 10th, 1883. So at the bottom there, you begin to see what the court's opinion was on these arguments about whether or not the 14th or 13th Amendment really had any real backing as far as federal power. So the court met in conference on consecutive Saturdays in late September and early October, and on October 10th, 1883 announced its holding by a vote of 8-1. Sections of 1 and 2 of the Civil Rights Act were held to be unconstitutional. So the court made this determination that in the situation of public accommodations, like an inn or theater or a restaurant, that denying access to those accommodations was not a violation of constitutional rights. And the way that they split that apart was to say that those who run inns or theaters or any sort of public accommodations are considered private actors under the law. Okay, they are private parties, they are private actors. The Constitution only applies to state actors, okay, to government. And it was not government denying them their rights. It was a private actor who's not beholden to actually recognize people's constitutional rights. So they made this distinction. They split hairs, basically, to say that these are private actors acting in a private capacity, and thereby, if they discriminate, it's in essence in their purview to do so, and that the federal government has no business insisting that they protect people's constitutional rights, because they are not government. So I don't bring this up as me saying that this makes sense. I bring it up just to let you know how the courts interpreted the laws at the time, both the amendments themselves, but well as the constitutional laws, legislation that was put in place. And so they made this distinction between private actors and state actors. And that has a very big bearing on how things operate today, because corporations are seen as private actors under the law. They are not the government. Therefore, corporations cannot violate your constitutional rights, for instance. So we talked about last night this idea that you have no free speech rights in the private workplace. Well, it's because the corporation is not seen as a state actor, it's seen as a private actor. So you have these interpretations of law that then have bearing on how the behavior results there forward. And so this distinction between private and state actor was the way of which they were able to eliminate the ability of the federal government in the case of law, not just the federal troops being on the ground, but law itself being there to protect basic civil rights, which also not only, of course, ushered in all the Jim Crow laws, all the segregation type laws that eventually came flooding in after that, is because it left it to the state and the local to consider whether or not they were going to do anything about that, but it was not the purview of the federal government to protect those constitutional rights. Jim?
So if you refuse to bake a cake for a gay wedding, that's a private act. But you're offering it as part of your public business. Is that how do they Has this been superseded, obviously?
So where we eventually ended up to about 100 years later, till we got to the 60s there, and the civil rights laws of that period, they eventually understood that if they were going to get rid of the discriminatory practices within law at state and local levels, and actually to enforce things like the 14th Amendment, as they were attempting to do post the Civil War period, they had to give it power, they had to give it teeth. So if you're going to do something in the way our constitutional structure is set up, where is one of the places where you can have real power and real teeth to actually have the Constitution work in the way you would like to see it work? Where do you look to in the Constitution to do something like that? We just, well, where within the language of the Constitution? So we walked through the Constitution before lunch, and we were pointing out, for instance, powers of Congress. So what power of Congress is there that one could point to maybe do civil rights protections? Congress.
Commerce.
So if you look at the civil rights laws of the 60s, how do they get their power? Well, they attached it to commerce. So what they said is people going to the inns and the theaters and taking the railroad cars, those laws that were discriminating them to access those services were interfering with commerce. And guess what? You at the local level and the state level can't interfere with commerce because that's a power of the US Congress. So that's how they got the civil rights laws to begin to have teeth. Well, they had to attach it to commerce. So it wasn't about protecting people's rights for the sake of about protecting people's rights, as we thought it should be. It was actually about giving it power by saying, well, you're interfering with commercial activity by actually denying access. So that's how it took that long for them, I think, to finally figure out how to give it real power under the way our Constitution is structured. So when we talk about how the system is built, you can begin to see that even if you want to try to do some good stuff, you have to define it as some type of commercial activity to even do what we'd see to be basic fundamental human rights within the way that our structure of governance and law works. Yeah. So you had this case, a very, very big case. It was probably the biggest case of its time. It was bigger than Plessy versus Ferguson for those who follow Supreme Court cases around discrimination. It was a very big deal. But if you heard me say, when it came to the case itself, the vote was 8-1. So obviously there was someone who felt very, very differently about the decision. And that is the next piece in the curriculum, is to hear a little bit from Judge Harlan, who was the dissenting vote in that particular case. And you can see what he thought about that interpretation and how it, in my mind at least, echoes more about this idea that we should be protecting fundamental human rights at all costs and not making this perversion between this sort of state and private actor, and then eventually having to find some sort of commercial orientation to give civil rights protections any real teeth.
And think back to Yates's critique in the Anti-Federalist section of the Constitution as enshrining all the power in the Supreme Court. Because when the Supreme Court decides in 1883, 8-1, precedent is set, and now until the Civil Rights Acts of the 60s, for 80 years you have licensing for black codes and Jim Crow as long as it's done privately and not at the state level. Imagine what would have been different because of the power of the Supreme Court and the precedent that it sets if they would have judged what we know now as rightly. The other thing about the Harlan dissent, which is on page 221, is while the rhetoric is very high sounding and reinforcing all of the right democratic principles, it's a reminder of how even though it's a powerfully written dissent, as a small excerpt here, it's one voice against 8, which doesn't change anything in the course of history because of the consolidation of power in the hands of those 9 people. Because once that decision is made, even if it's 5-4, we know how it stays, and there's little if any recourse to change it. So this is Mr. Justice Harlan dissenting in the civil rights cases 1883. I'll read the whole thing, and you'll hear some of the language that we've been reinforcing on those downward shifts of the giant rubber band on the graph. The opinion in these cases proceeds, it seems to me, upon grounds entirely too narrow and artificial. I cannot resist the conclusion that the substance and spirit of the recent amendments of the Constitution have been sacrificed by a subtle and ingenious verbal criticism. Quote, it is not the words of the law, but the internal sense of it that makes the law. The letter of the law is the body. The sense and reason of the law is the soul, unquote. Constitutional provisions adopted in the interest of liberty and for the purpose of securing through national legislation, if need be, rights inhering in a state of freedom and belonging to American citizenship, have been so construed as to defeat the ends the people desired to accomplish, which they attempted to accomplish and which they supposed they had accomplished by changes in their fundamental law. If we apply this to where we're going next, you've got the 14th Amendment passed to provide due process and equal protection to living, breathing people who are now recognized as property under a system of law that prior recognized them as property. Almost immediately after the passage of the 14th Amendment, you have corporate lawyers bringing Supreme Court cases to have them start to find, quote unquote, corporations in the 14th Amendment. Because if you look at the wording of the 14th Amendment, it refers to persons, not citizens, but persons. And so it moves so quickly that by 1871, I've got the quote here, one of the justices on the Supreme Court, Justice Brennan, declares, quote, by 1871, it was well understood that corporations should be treated as natural persons for virtually all purposes of constitutional and statutory analysis, unquote. So you've got the careful construction of the machine with all of its levers, while people are still working on how do we protect freed slaves. And they're that many steps ahead in the consolidation and the centralization of power and preemption. It isn't.
I think maybe take just a quick break and then we'll dive into that. So we're on the chart, basically we're here again, and as Brad's referring to, you have this new constitutional amendment. We've been hearing how freed slaves have been trying to use it, how women have been trying to use it, and in a large degree unsuccessful. Yet we'll begin to see how corporations latch onto that and become very successful at actually finding constitutional protections, not only under the 14th Amendment, but other Bill of Rights protections and other elements of the U.S. Constitution. Long before, for instance, even women got the right to vote. So just to show how the system has worked, what it wants to recognize as greater value versus what it doesn't. Any questions before we take a couple-minute break, or any comments that people want to make?
The high point on the graph is the emotional and psychological low point for all of us. So it's flipped upside down.
All right.